Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Democracy and Deal-Making, the Rise of Crony Capitalism. My name is Sarah Bonk, the founder and CEO of Business for America. For those joining us for the first time today, Business for America is a business membership organization, a national, nonpartisan nonprofit, and we focus exclusively on how companies and business associations can help foster a healthy representative democracy, greater bipartisanship, and effective government. Our member companies come from across the country in all different sectors and sizes, from Fortune 500s to small startups. At the core of our mission is the understanding that the business community has a bottom line economic interest in how our democratic institutions function, and that this is a genuinely nonpartisan issue. We also believe that talking about the problem is not enough, so we work with businesses to take meaningful action together. We would love to invite your business to become a member, and you can learn more at bfa.us. So today we're talking about crony capitalism, and before we get to our panelists, I wanted to set a little context. And who better to represent capitalism than Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith? That's his sculpture there. Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, his magnum opus, was published in 1776, the same year the American colonies declared our independence from Great Britain. And Smith argued that economic competition would work like an invisible hand, and it would maximize profits, boost quality, boost innovation, lower our prices, and keep the economy stable. But of course, things are not quite that simple, and the government does play a role in our economy. And when the government regulates the market, it will influence markets, and it creates winners and it creates losers. And so I had an example to illustrate this point from just 3 years earlier than the publishing of Wealth of Nations. On December 16th, 1773, a group called the Sons of Liberty led the infamous Boston Tea Party protest. Now, most of us learned in elementary school that these colonists were upset about paying taxes while having no representation in the British Parliament, right? That was where the phrase "no taxation without representation" came from. But what you may not know is that the tea that the colonists threw in the harbor was exempt from taxes. So if these colonists were so mad about paying taxes, why were they protesting by throwing products that were not taxed into the harbor? Were they opposed to saving money? Well, to understand this, we need to look at the British East India Company, which was the largest corporation in the world at the time. The company had gone heavily into debt and was on the verge of bankruptcy. The British Parliament decided that the company was basically too big to fail. They wanted to protect them from bankruptcy. And Parliament exempted the company from the tea tax so that they could undercut the competition, sell more tea, and get out of debt. And it will probably not surprise you to learn that the king himself and most of the British Parliament were shareholders in the company. Sounds like a conflict of interest to me. Another interesting historical tidbit that we often miss is that the protest was led by Boston businessmen and merchants whose colonial businesses were still subject to taxes and were now at a competitive disadvantage. So there you have it, our country's most famous historical case of crony capitalism. So I'm sure our expert panelists will have many more examples of crony capitalism for us, both past and present, here and abroad. And I hope that each of you joining us today will take away valuable insights and identify actionable solutions, including what the business community can do to help restore fair competition and rebuild public trust in our government. That is, after all, what the mission of Business for America is all about. Lots for us to think about and discuss. So thank you all once again for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Richard Idlin, Business for America's National Policy Director. Richard, please take it away.
Good. Thank you, Bonk. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And so today's topic, democracy and deal making, the rise of crony capitalism, is going to focus on a few issues, a number of which Bonk just described. And we're going to look at the concern that businesses and trade associations have regarding their competitive advantage or disadvantage if we have a system of favorites and a spoil system in which certain companies, because of their political connections, are benefiting vis-a-vis others who don't. And what are the risks that are posed to the broader economy and to a sense of fairness and competition in a free market system? We're going to also dive a little bit into the history of the spoil system, then do an assessment of what's happening in Washington, D.C. now in the Trump administration, and also offer some insights into how the same challenges of cronyism are showing up in countries like Hungary and India. And finally, we'll look at what some of the remedies and safeguards are, and some formal, others informal, and what businesses can do to help push forward necessary reforms. So let me introduce our panelists. And we have three really esteemed folks today who've thought a lot about this topic from different perspectives. Thomas Berry, or Tommy Berry, located in DC, is the director of the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies and the editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Before joining Cato, Tommy was an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation and clerk for Judge E. Grady Jolly of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Mr. Berry's areas of interest include the separation of powers, executive branch appointments, and First Amendment freedom of speech issues. He is a frequent writer for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, and the National Law Review. Thomas has also testified on the Appointments Clause of the Constitution before a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate. Professor Richard Painter joins us from Minnesota today, where he is the S. Walter Ritchie Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota Law School since 2007. From February of 2005 to July of 2007, Richard was the associate counsel to President Bush in the White House counsel's office, serving as the chief ethics lawyer for the president, White House employees, and cabinet officials who required Senate confirmation. Richard has on 6 occasions provided testimony before committees of the U.S. House and the Senate on government ethics, securities litigation, and the role of attorneys in corporate governance. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and served for a while as an attorney with Sullivan and Cromwell in New York City, and is also the author of a book published in 2009, Getting the Government America Deserves: How Ethics Reform Can Make a Difference. Sarah Rapucci joins us from New York City today, where she is an independent business consultant drawing on more than 25 years of experience in the social impact, human rights, and democracy world. She's worked for The Economist as head of global policy research programs, also with Freedom House, where she was VP of Research and Analysis, and also has spent a number of years working with the Global Business Initiative for Human Rights. So thank you all for joining us. And again, this is going to be a conversation, but let me start with reading a quote from former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan and asking each of you just to quickly comment on that. And Tommy, I'll ask you to go first. Years ago, Mr. Greenspan said, crony capitalism is essentially a condition in which public officials are giving favors to people in the private sector in payment of political favors. Do you think that's an adequate description? Anything you would offer in addition to that?
Sure, I think that's a great start and kind of gets to the heart of it. What I might add is that it goes both ways. It's not just giving favors to friends, it's also punishing enemies. Which can be equally problematic and equally harmful when someone doesn't give a politician what they want or has crossed them either in the political arena or in the personal arena, and the politician uses their power, their source of authority to deny them benefits or deny them an equal shot at some sort of government program. And I just say, in general, in broad view, why is it problematic? It's when decisions are made based on inappropriate criteria, instead of setting out sort of objective criteria for who wins and who loses any sort of government test. It's when government officials are picking winners and losers based on their friends and enemies.
Right, right. Thank you. Sarah, what's your point of view? Would you amend that definition at all?
I agree as well. I think what I would add is in a lot of cases, the government actually creates the opportunities for the private sector to benefit, right? And specifically certain segments of the private sector. So it's definitely not to be confused with other forms of corruption, which are almost a free market for who benefits, but where the government is actually partnering to a certain extent with certain elements of the private sector that it finds most loyal.
Most loyal. Okay, good. I think that's an important point. And Richard, based on your experience, what would you add to that?
Well, this is just the old-fashioned mercantilism that Sarah was speaking about with the East India Company. It's what the founders rejected. It's what Adam Smith rejected. Edmund Burke on the floor of the House of Commons spoke out against the corruption of the East India Company and the corruption of the Parliament by the East India Company. And that's what we were rebelling against. It's what we wanted, a free market economy. And I should emphasize these problems in Great Britain went back before the American Revolution in 1720. They had the South Sea Company, where you had members of Parliament trading in the stock. The King's mistress was trading in the stock. I think the Queen was left out of the action. But they passed these bills giving the South Sea Company a monopoly on trade in the South Seas, and they weren't doing any trading in the South Seas. It was just all a fraud, and the whole thing ended up with a bubble collapse in 1720. I gave the legal history lecture at the University of Chicago on the South Sea bubble, and just the sheer hypocrisy of Parliament in that manner. And this is exactly what we didn't want in the United States. We rebelled against that. And I should also, I want to mention my 2016 book, Taxation Only with Representation, the conservative conscience and campaign finance reform, and how we need to get the corporate money out of politics, which is driving a heck of a lot of this, whether it's Elon Musk up in Pennsylvania just last year, or what's been going on even before this is the United case from the Supreme Court. Until we fix our campaign finance system, we're going to continue to have this, and we're going to lose a free market economy and go back toward the mercantilism. And that's, of course, the way China and a lot of other countries around the world, Russia, you got the oligarchs that Putin likes, and they become billionaires, and the other ones go to Siberia. And if that's where we want to go, that's what we want to do, I guess. But it's not the American way. It's not what our founders wanted.
Good. All right, well, we're going to return to some of those important topics, but Tommy, let me go back to you and maybe give us a short history, not going all the way back to the Revolutionary War per se, but maybe starting in the 1880s when the spoils system, as we've come to understand it, seemed to have shaped and begun, to be more noticeable in the United States. So could you give us a little bit of a quick history on crony capitalism as it shows up in federal politics?
Sure. So one of the big avenues, as you mentioned, the so-called spoils system, during that time in the 1880s was kind of the peak of that system. There is a notion that winning an election essentially meant all of your friends got jobs. So to some extent, government jobs were not seen as civil service positions that simply go to the most qualified people. They were seen as benefits to be doled out to the people who had helped you get into office. So we didn't have any of the tenure protections we have now for the civil service. We didn't have people serving under both Republican and Democratic administrations. We had essentially everyone getting fired when the White House changed parties and people expecting to be given certain jobs. We still see this in higher ranking positions. You see this, for example, with ambassadors. Those positions are often given to the biggest donors for political parties. But imagine that for thousands of jobs across the federal government, going down to the individual clerks running, the post offices and everything in each individual city. And there was such a reaction against that, especially with an assassination that was essentially prompted by the Garfield and then Arthur assassination, that people thought that we can't have this going forward, and that's what led to a lot of the civil service reforms. I'll also mention one other historical example from that era, the 1870s case, the slaughterhouse cases, in which the Supreme Court essentially upheld a chartered slaughterhouse that was given a monopoly in New Orleans. Essentially the power to have a monopoly over running slaughterhouses in the city of New Orleans. The Supreme Court held it didn't violate the 14th Amendment to do that. In my view, that was an egregiously wrong decision. But that's a good example of, in the 1870s, cities were already essentially picking winners and losers through this so-called public-private partnership, essentially chartering a quasi-public, quasi-private corporation, giving it a monopoly, and putting dozens of private slaughterhouses out of business.
Mhm. And what are some more contemporary examples, be they from a Democratic or Republican administration? Because this is certainly not a partisan approach to governing, right? Both parties have made use of the spoils system. So can you think of something maybe, in the Kennedy-Johnson administration that, is exemplary of this kind of behavior?
Well, I think anytime that you have, government contracts, there's ability for abuse. I would say for me, the bigger issue is not so much the obvious cases of corruption. Probably the high point was the Teapot Dome scandal, where you literally just had bribes being paid to the Secretary of the Interior to pick someone to get a contract, to do something for the government, to give them the land that they needed. That's sort of blatant. But in my view, what's even more concerning and more under the radar is when you just have, lobbying, the so-called concentrated interests and diverse costs, where one specific business or one specific faction of the economy will get favors or will get public policy to boost their business, probably at the expense of the greater good. So I'd point to ethanol subsidies as an example of that today, where you have a very politically powerful, distinct business that's managed to essentially convince the federal government that it will cause an uproar and vote people out of office if it doesn't get the subsidies it's expecting. At the local level, I'd also point to protectionist policies like restrictions on food trucks. That may seem very mundane, but I worked a lot in those cases when I was at Pacific Legal Foundation, that essentially brick and mortar restaurants want to protect their business, want to keep upstarts out, and the local governments help them by putting onerous restrictions on where you can park a food truck. Seems minor, but that to me is a classic example of using government power to help an entrenched business, not for actual good public policy.
Good. Thank you. I think you've helped us broaden the understanding of what cronyism can show up as. And Richard, let me turn to you for a moment. So Tommy's noted that there are preferences given to certain industries, certain companies. There's a government contracting process. There's procurement. There is tax preferences that can also be used to manipulate the market and give out favors. But one of the antidotes seems to be oversight, right? And having a set of rules in place. So, in your work with the Bush administration, give us a sense of how, what are the rules currently in place to guard against some of the abuses that Tommy described? So historically, what have the remedies been to the kind of excesses Tommy's described?
Well, first, there's a criminal conflict of interest statute at 18 United States Code 208, which makes it a crime for any executive branch official to participate in a government matter that has an effect on their own financial interest, that they know has an effect on their own financial interest. This criminal statute applies to every official, every employee in the executive branch, except for two. The president and the vice president are not covered by this statute. Neither are the members of Congress who are busy trading on stocks while they're voting on bills. I have urged that this statute be applied to the president, the vice president, and the members of Congress as well. But at least for the others, that statute does apply. We have financial disclosure rules where the financial interests of the highest ranking officials must be disclosed in a publicly available financial disclosure form called a Form 278, available to the public. I testified about this on February 25 of this year at a hearing of the U.S. House at the Natural Resources Committee on, guess what, space mining. Now, who wants to get into space mining, where you're going up to the asteroids and looking for valuable minerals and everything? Well, they had the space mining companies there. Well, that's fine if they want to do that on their own dime, but why are they in front of Congress? And I told the committee I felt like I was there on Shark Tank or something, where everyone's making a pitch and the and the members behind the panel there, the members of Congress, I guess, are deciding who to throw taxpayer money at. Well, my problem with space money is this is something Elon Musk really wants pretty badly. I mean, SpaceX is going to be involved in all this. Well, the point I had to make was Elon Musk better have nothing to do with anything involving NASA or our space program while he is a financial interest in SpaceX. He's a United States government employee, at least for the time being. Now, they call him a special government employee, part-timer, which means they say they don't have to disclose his financial report. I said that was a bunch of hooey. He doesn't seem to be acting like a part-time employee at all. He's dismantling a good part of the federal government. So bottom line is we need more transparency. We need to enforce the financial disclosure rules. We need to enforce the financial conflict of interest rules. This has been a problem in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And we need to take conflicts of interest seriously and not just treat it as a political issue. I'm happy to, of course, I was a Republican for 30 years. I got plenty of examples where Democrats went, in violation of these statutes and crony capitalism and the rest of it. It's a bipartisan problem. We need to address it, or we're going to lose our free market and ultimately our free country.
And if you think back, Richard, to 20 years ago during the Bush second term of the Bush administration, and you compare that to what's happening now today in the Trump administration, and you mentioned Elon Musk a few times now. So is this somewhat unprecedented, or are there parallels that you would draw historically?
Well, we've had the problem, of course, with both our space program and our military spending. The military budget is now getting close to $1 trillion, some 800 and $900 billion, with the companies trying to get into the federal trough there, and you get the taxpayer money. This is something Dwight D. Eisenhower pointed out back in 1961 in his farewell address, talking about the military-industrial complex. So I had to keep my eyes on Lockheed Martin, Boeing, all those companies. They're trying to get in the door and get preferential treatment. And we have a system for bidding on Defense Department contracts and the rest of it, rules for procurement, rules on conflicts of interest, and those rules absolutely need to be enforced. And particularly in the military area, we found this could be a problem. After 9/11, we ramped up defense spending a lot. And of course, everyone wants a piece of the action. And its taxpayers end up paying for all that. So this has been an ongoing battle for a long time. But if you start abandoning the rules and say rules don't matter, we can violate the rules because we won an election or something like that, then it's going to be complete chaos. And the cost of running this government is going to go up through the roof. And I'd start with our military contractors is where I'd spend the most attention, because that's where the enormous amounts of money goes out the door.
Okay, good. I want to return to those points, but get Sarah into this conversation also. So Sarah, you have spent a good bit of time thinking about and studying governments outside the US where these kinds of problems also take place. And, we had chatted about focusing on Hungary and India in particular, governments that have what many described, are declining in trust in democracy, sort of more authoritarian leaning, and to some extent may be representative of some of the trend here in the United States. So when you reflect on both what Tommy and Richard have highlighted, with stifling of free market, depressing competition, certain favored industries or business people benefiting from the spoil system, what are the impacts in a country like Hungary, for instance? What are we seeing there, and what should we be thinking about as we see this evolving in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting to look at these comparative examples, because I think a lot of times in the United States, we think we're the only ones that have experienced something, or we're the only ones who have experienced it like this. But we have seen these trends over and over in other democracies, like Hungary. So in Hungary, just as a reminder, we have Viktor Orban in place as the head of the Fidesz party, and they took power in 2010. And they've amassed immense power around the executive through what's been a gradual process there of administrative changes and targeting of the opposition. In that time, business in Hungary has been almost fully co-opted by the government. One estimate shows that as much as 20% of the private sector now in Hungary is run based on loyalty to the government, as opposed to market principles and competitive practices. And Fidesz achieved this by selectively implementing tax and other regulations, preferential award of licenses, and also a discriminatory set of price caps that favored its preferred companies. And they nationalized the companies that they didn't like. So as many as 200 companies were nationalized by the end of Orbán's second term. One thing that I think is really important about Hungary is that there were some companies that thought they were safe. And the reason why they thought they were safe is because they thought that they were a government favorite. But because this whole system is unpredictable and is led by just a couple of people at the top, you never quite know where you stand. And Orbán ended up going after some companies that had seemed like favorites. And it seems like he did that just to assert his own supremacy in the economy. And that has created this system that is a little bit insecure. I think another interesting lesson from Hungary is the way that Fidesz was able to sow division in the private sector. They divided the private sector into the companies they like and then the companies they were going to target. And by doing that, there was a lack of coordination and instead of fragmentation of enterprise that made them weaker in face of the other changes that were happening in the country that they might not have been in favor of. So I'll just sort of wrap up by talking about the impact on the Hungarian economy. Orbán talks very bullishly of the Hungarian economy, but he can do that because he controls the media and he controls the data that that comes out. In reality, it seems like the picture is much more mixed. When independent economists take a look at the Hungarian economy, they're seeing that industrial production is in decline. It's down 4% from last year. Economic growth last year was under 1%. Inflation in 2023, it's come down since then, but it was as high as 17% in 2023. That's incredibly high. And Hungary has been left being one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest, in the EU. So the impacts have been really strong, and the rhetoric around it has been really different.
Mm-hmm. Now, Hungary is a parliamentary system, so the legislature has done what in response to these moves on part of the federal government?
So when I was talking about those gradual changes, one of the things that Orbán has been able to do is make sure that he had support in Parliament, total support. And he was quite popular at the beginning, and so he had a certain amount of support. But he engaged in what we would call gerrymandering, changing districts to make sure that his supporters stayed in power. At one point, he was even able to amass a supermajority in the parliament, which means that he had the ability to change the constitution. So through these and other measures, he's been able to keep the parliament compliant and supportive of what he's wanted to do.
And Sarah, can you give us some examples of types of companies or types of industries that have received special favors? And I presume that is because they made contributions to his campaigns, maybe are towing the line in a way that others are not. So what, who's benefiting, and why do you think there has been some willingness on the part of the private sector to comply?
In Hungary, a lot of it has been personality driven. There have been people who were Orbán's friends growing up who have benefited. So it's not necessarily certain industries as much, and Hungarian industry is not world renowned, right? It's not necessarily certain industries that have benefited as much as certain people, and those people have gotten these different kinds of government favors, licenses, contracts, preferential treatment, and then they can build these conglomerates that are sort of a mix of different things. They've also, at the same time, gone after some industries that you might not, even really think about, like grocery store chains. And we have seen some pushback actually recently from the Spar grocery store chain, because Hungary, the ruling party was trying to put in place a set of special taxes that seemed to be directly targeting that specific company. But in general, Hungarian business has been quite quiet in face of what has been happening.
Okay, good. Tommy, let me move back to you here. And you had mentioned that, in response to the definition that Alan Greenspan offered, that, there are favors given and then there are those that are punished. So if you think about the emergence of this tariff regime, from the White House now, and incoherent as it is, but it certainly does seem that a series of special favors and dispensations and exemptions are taking place. That is one element, it seems, of punishing certain people and maybe favoring others. We might have other examples in contracting that Richard pointed out, but and tax policy as well. But give us a sense of how cronyism and tariffs may be related, if at all.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think one of the big lessons from this is the danger of granting the president wide and broad emergency powers. So the president is claiming the authority to enact these tariffs under a statute called IEPA, IEEPA, which essentially says that when the president declares an emergency at the border, he can take certain trade actions to rectify that emergency. In my view, in fact, tariffs are not authorized under this statute. So I should note there's litigation just starting. The New Civil Liberties Alliance, a law firm we've collaborated with many times, has filed a lawsuit saying that IEPA does not authorize tariffs. And I think that they're correct about that. But the fact that it's even close shows that Congress has gone too far in enacting statutes with broad and vague discretionary powers to the executive branch. And what we see is when the president is given even the appearance of that amount of discretion, you can very easily use emergencies as just a fig leaf, as just a hook to really enact previous policy goals and to change on a dime based on picking winners and losers. And we're seeing both of those. So President Trump claims these tariffs are justified by the fentanyl emergency, by drug smuggling emergency, but it's obvious that the numbers he's setting have nothing to do with which countries might be having a problem of fentanyl coming over the border. It's purely based on either his notion of a trade imbalance or just his notion of which countries have fallen into favor or disfavor based on who wants to do a deal and so forth. And because the executive branch can act quicker and more decisively, the downside is they can flip on a dime quicker when people fall in and out of favor. So even though certainly legislatures can also enact bills with crony capitalism, like ethanol subsidies, I think the problem is even worse and even more common when too much discretion is given to the executive branch to act without the legislature explicitly picking who gets certain rules in the text of the legislation.
Mhm. Good. Thank you. Richard, do you want to comment on that? And also maybe second part that I'd welcome your insight into is the treatment of law firms now and the executive orders that have been issued from the White House concerning law firms. And is that another angle here on crony capitalism?
Yes, there are many angles on crony capitalism, and tariffs are very much connected with crony capitalism, because tariffs can be used to protect industries that are in favor with the government. So generally, a free market economy is consistent with a low tariff regime, a free trade regime. Now, that doesn't mean you have unlimited free trade. There are obviously situations where countries are going to abuse that, engage in dumping products that is a threat to American industry. But tariffs are closely linked with crony capitalism. The United States passed tariffs actually through Congress. At least the president did it the right way through Congress in 1930. President Hoover signed a Smoot-Hawley tariff bill. It was certainly constitutional because Congress had passed the law, but it was a devastating blow to the American economy and exacerbated the problems from the stock market crash the previous year and lengthened the depression throughout the 1930s. Other countries around the world retaliated and also retreated into crony capitalism or worse. The Porsche family in Germany wanted to start a company to make cars for the people, a people's car, a Volkswagen, similar to Henry Ford's model in the United States, but went to the German government and persuaded the new Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler, to sponsor that company, to promote the company, and convince Germans to send money to the company. 5 Mark pro Woche sparen, 5 marks a week save, and you get your own car. Einige Wagen fahren. Who got their own car? Nobody got a car. They used the company, of course, to build military vehicles for the most part. And so crony capitalism, where companies go to the government to get the support of the government, not only destroys a free market, but can destroy a democracy. One of the fundamental parts of a democracy, critical to democracy, is embodied in the First Amendment, is a right to petition government for redress of grievances. That's what lawyers do for clients in court. And when we have the government retaliating against lawyers for their clients, this is not just crony capitalism, favoring law firms that the government likes over the law firms the government does not like, but penalizing the exercise of First Amendment rights by the lawyer's clients to hire counsel to petition the government for redress of grievance. John Adams understood this when he represented the British soldiers who were charged with the Boston Massacre with murder. And he was very unpopular in Boston with a lot of the people there who hated what the soldiers had done, shooting at civilians. But John Adams said everybody's entitled to counsel, and I'm going to represent them. He became our second president of the United States. The founders understood the importance of not only a free press, but a free bar. That lawyers must be free to represent the clients of their choice and not be penalized by the government for that. And so those executive orders targeting Covington and Burling and Perkins Coie and other law firms because of who their clients were or what their particular representations undertaken by partners or former partners are an offense to the bar, to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And I'm hoping the Supreme Court is very quickly going to strike those down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sarah, when you reflect back on your experience in Hungary or India or Brazil, and then you think about Richard's description here of the adherence to the rule of law, one of the ingredients of a stable political system seems to be transparency, right? And the fact that there needs to be oversight. So one of the things that has dawned on me as inspector general programs get hollowed out in the federal government, there's very little transparency, and it's hard to track some of what's going on and the examples of cronyism. So have we seen similar examples from Hungary or Brazil or India where the independent nature of the oversight process is diminished?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think it's those independent accountability mechanisms that a leader with undemocratic tendencies wants to get out of the way. I'll give you an example from India. So in India, you have a system of crony capitalism where companies can buy these electoral bonds, which is basically an unaccountable way for them to give money to the ruling party. And over the time that Prime Minister Modi and his BJP party have been in power, they've basically consolidated the private sector into just 2 or 3 conglomerates per industry. The Adani Group is the emblematic crony capitalist company in India. Mr. Adani has at some point been the richest man in India, and is still one of the richest men in India. And he and Modi go way back till from before he was prime minister. The Adani Group was accused of financial malfeasance in the United States in 2023. And in that case, Prime Minister Modi made sure that the so-called independent investigation that took place in India of what had gone on was stacked in the Adani Group's favor. So in exchange for all of the loyalty that they had from that company, they ensured that first the legislature was not able to do an independent investigation. And then when the Supreme Court stepped in, the judges were stacked in Adani's favor. So these are the types of checks that are supposed to be in place, whether that's independent investigation with the judiciary, civil society, the media. These are all the ways that we know what's happening, and that there can be checks on executive power, and then of course the legislature as well. And the places to watch when you're wondering whether we continue to have the strong democratic system in the United States that we've been so proud of for so long.
Tommy, when you think about remedies to these challenges, based in part on some of what Sarah just said, it seems as though there are a few strategies. And Richard, I'd like you to comment on this. One is certainly reassertion of Article 1 powers by Congress, right? Secondly is adherence to the existing standards and laws. Are there other remedies to what we're seeing growing here in the current political climate?
Definitely. There are a lot of avenues for court challenges. There are several constitutional provisions, some more obscure than others, that I think plaintiffs should be relying on, should be thinking about, and in many cases have been. So one of the most obvious and most powerful is the First Amendment. That's been cited by the law firms in challenging these actions taken against them. Anytime the president picks winners and losers as punishment for speech, you can immediately bring a First Amendment claim, particularly if it's as punishment for the viewpoints expressed. That's kind of the ultimate red line in First Amendment doctrine that's almost never justifiable by the government. Even in some cases where they might be able to distinguish based on content, they can almost never punish based on viewpoint. The Associated Press has already won at the district court level its lawsuit. Basically, the evidence is that they were excluded from press conferences because they used the term Gulf of Mexico instead of Gulf of America. And similarly, the executive orders themselves say that these law firms have been singled out in part for who they represented, which causes they forwarded, and the arguments they made in court, which not only violates the petitions clause, but violates the free speech clause in my view. There are other provisions of the Constitution. One that's more obscure is called the Bill of Attainder clause. That applies clearly to statutes that essentially says you can't pass a law that singles out one specific person for punishment. You need to pass generalized rules. There is a long history of bills of attainder being abused in England. That's one of the things the framers were concerned about. There is an interesting constitutional question that I believe has never been decided by the Supreme Court, which is, does the Bill of Attainder clause apply to executive orders from the president? But I've seen some commentary making a convincing case that when an executive order essentially operates like a statute in that it's setting a policy for the federal government, that the same principle should apply. The framers might not have anticipated executive orders being what they are today, but if for all intents and purposes you're singling out, it doesn't make a lot of sense that a legislature singling out a person for punishment or a business for punishment is unconstitutional, but the president can get away with it through a loophole. And then even more generally, I'd point to the Equal Protection Clause. The 14th Amendment says equal protection. In general, it's much more easy to win those cases when the discrimination is based on immutable characteristics like race and sex, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to win a case based on other improper reasons for being set out. At the very least, the government needs to have a rational, policy-based basis, and animus is not a legitimate basis for singling people out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And just a quick reminder for those of you in the audience, you're welcome to pose a question, use the Q&A, and we're happy to answer that. Richard, reflecting back on your work in the White House, you supervise the ethics pledge, which is a formal process, right? And then there are less formal methods. So I know, or I've read, that the Trump administration has not really enforced adherence to standard financial disclosure requirements or ethical commitments. And what should we be thinking about regarding the use of those tools to address the problem?
Well, this ties into the question of presidential power, particularly the power to remove federal officials under the so-called unitary executive theory. Donald Trump has removed the director of the Office of Government Ethics, removed the director of the Office of Special Counsel, which enforces the civil service laws, removed over 12 inspectors general in the United States government. He has appointed the Hunter Biden whistleblower, I guess, to be the interim or the acting director of the IRS. The list goes on and on. It's the use of presidential power to control the agencies that then can be used to undermine ethics rules at the discretion of the president. And the broader theme, it's a theme I'm addressing in a book I co-author with Tom Sullivan with Cambridge University Press that's coming out later this year on presidential power, is that we have had an extraordinary growth of presidential power in the United States over the past century, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, far in excess of what the framers actually contemplated in the Constitution. The framers envisioned Congress as being the preeminent power in the federal government, and many of the powers being reserved for the states. So just to take one example, the industry I've worked in now for 30 years of higher education, what would the founders have thought of the President of the United States unilaterally imposing a bill of attainder on a college that had been founded in 1636 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over 150 years before the founding of our country, that the president unilaterally could seek to use the IRS to impose, in effect, a bill of attainder on Harvard College. Now, I have long believed that the wealthy universities in this country have taken advantage of crony capitalism by getting government contracts, often with the support of the Democrats, at the expense of public higher education, the field that I've worked in now for 30 years. I think we do need to think seriously about how much money has been accumulated with the wealthiest universities and whether we adequately fund public higher education. Those are serious issues. I don't disagree with the Trump administration about some of their concerns about the elite universities, but I'm going to emphasize that we cannot have a democracy if the president of the United States unilaterally can decide he's going to sink a university, a private university, simply because he disagrees with the way a private university is run. That is completely incompatible with what the intent of the framers was. So let's get back to presidential power, abuse of presidential power. The founders did not want a dictator. They didn't want a King George. I've got my replica here of the Liberty Bowl. Paul Revere. It's just a replica. The original is in the Boston Fine Arts Museum. But that was in the commemoration of the members of the Boston legislature who basically voted a big F-you middle finger to King George after the Boston Tea Party, that we were not going to put up with crony capitalism in this country. And we did not want another King George. And the idea that you could have a president with just such extraordinary powers is inconsistent with a democracy. We really need to revisit presidential power. This isn't just about Donald Trump. I can talk about the torture memos under President Bush that I strongly, strongly disagreed with. The idea that somehow a CIA agent official could say that they could violate the criminal torture statute invoking presidential power. The list of abuses goes on, and we need to figure that out. The founders gave us the answer. It's in the Constitution. But I don't think that document's been right now.
Right. Thank you. So again, just a reminder, if anyone has a question out there, please pose it. I wanted to use our last, 8 or so minutes, getting your insights, the three of you, on what the private sector should be thinking about specifically, and maybe what actions they can conceivably take. And so we've had a number of examples given about conflict of interest, about cronyism, acknowledge that certain sectors of the economy may benefit certain individuals, certain friends of well-placed politicians. But Sarah, let me start with you. And you mentioned the Spar grocery store chain, which I know nothing about in Hungary, but might be an interesting story to convey to us. And is there some lesson to be learned for American businesses who are watching quite warily about what's happening in universities, in media outlets, elsewhere, and wondering what is it they can be doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be done. And I think it's interesting not just to look at Hungary, where things haven't turned out so well, but some of the countries that have resisted crony capitalism and changed their leader, because ultimately we still have elections, and whatever happens under this administration, eventually it will no longer be in office. And some examples that I really like are in Poland or in Brazil, where the private sector really pushed to have to end the regime of a leader who was pushing for crony capitalism. This is the Peace Party in the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. In both of those cases, the private sector saw that they were losing out on the rule of law, that their economies were less competitive. And a very important thing to keep in mind is that when you have a system of crony capitalism, when you're favoring loyalty, what you're favoring is loyalty over competitiveness. And we want our economy to be competitive. We want it to be as innovative as it has been, and why it's been one of the greatest economies in the world. So in both Poland and in Brazil, the private sector did two things. They spoke out. They united across not just different companies, but across industries, which I think is another strength in the United States, is that we have a very diverse economy. So the tech companies don't all have to congregate together. They can cooperate with defense companies or with grocery chains. And so they spoke up publicly, but then they also did things behind the scenes. And in Poland, business associations got together in order to support, get out the vote campaigns, to support civil society actors that were doing work, pro-democracy work. And in both of those cases, these undemocratic parties were voted out of office.
Okay, good. Thank you. Tommy, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Sure. So I come at it, again, as a former litigator and a current director of an amicus brief program. I look to the courts first and foremost, and I just emphasize that there's strength in numbers and in maybe not unanimity, but in kind of, the I'm Spartacus type scene where everybody joins together to push back against this rather than letting people kind of flap in the wind. So I thought it was really inspiring, for example, that in the Perkins Coie litigation, there were amicus briefs against the government joined by dozens or in some cases hundreds of organizations. There was one on behalf of law firms, hundreds of law firms. Cato Institute joined an amicus brief of a dozen organizations across the political spectrum, ACLU, Institute for Justice, FIRE, etc. And the more people form a united front, the harder it is for any one individual one to be singled out or to be picked off. So I would say it's important for people to it's so tempting to just lie low, like hope you're not spotted when the government is being vindictive in the way it is. But in general, I think it's better to show some courage and try to get strength in numbers and collaborate. And whether it's an amicus brief or a class action lawsuit or what have you, in pushing back against this. And even if you might be a temporary beneficiary of some of it, I think what we've seen is that it just doesn't last. I mean, look at companies that are in favor one day and out of favor the next. Better to push for a better and more stable system than just hope you can stay a winner for as long as possible.
Right, right. I think it was interesting just on that point that a number of the law firms, having made what they thought was a deal, are now possibly discovering that there's more that they'll have to pay or concede or work on cases that are completely inconsistent with their principles. So,
Yeah, it's the Darth Vader scene. I've altered the deal. Pray I do not alter it further.
I see. Okay. Good. And Richard, what are your recommendations to the private sector on how they can address this challenge?
Business people and American citizens need to insist that we return to our founding principles and the tradition in the United States of a free market economy. That means a smaller federal government that is run primarily by Congress, consistent with the statutes passed by Congress, not at the will of one man, but Congress, and a smaller federal government returning power to the states, and most important, returning power to the citizens, and a private free enterprise. That's been our tradition in the United States. And we've had debates about how much government regulation there should be of business. Completely unregulated free market economics doesn't work. We learned that in the 1929 stock market crash, and we had a correction there under President Roosevelt with some government regulation of business. But if government gets too big, that is a grave threat to the independence of our economy and to our citizenry. The extreme models were experimented with in Europe: socialism, communism, where the government owns everything and confiscates private property and owns businesses. The major industries being controlled by government, eventually under communism, everything being controlled by government. And unfortunately, some of the business executives and others, particularly in Germany and other countries, just going for another version of socialism called National Socialism, where the businesses would get favors from the government in return for supporting the government. But National Socialism was socialism nonetheless, of just a much more pernicious kind. And ultimately, freedom, liberty is lost when government has control over business to such an extent as it has in the socialist, the National Socialist, the communist regimes. And in the United States, we need to scale back presidential power and government power in general so that our free market economy can flourish.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Really great insights. I'll just quickly try to summarize. I think what Business for America will be doing in the coming months around this issue is looking for bipartisan efforts in Congress to support separation of powers, hold people accountable. I think one issue that we're looking at is Tommy mentioned about insider trading. So preventing members of Congress, Richard also mentioned that, from trading on information, trading stocks on information. Also looking at other initiatives to support the rule of law and an independent oversight capacity. So those are fortunately all efforts taking place in Congress with Democrat and Republican support. And we encourage businesses to get behind those initiatives as they occur. So I want to thank each of you, Tommy, Richard, Sarah, so much for your insights here. I think it was really interesting conversation. This has been recorded, so we'll post this on YouTube, and we'll also have a Medium blog on this, and encourage anyone interested in talking further to be in touch. So again, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.